Did Alan Ladd really hate Robert Mitchum? That's the kind of headline that grabs attention, and it's easy to see why. Two legendary actors from the golden age of Hollywood, both known for their brooding stares and quiet intensity, seemingly locked in a behind-the-scenes rivalry? It's a juicy story. But here's the truth most people don't know. The feud didn't exist. In fact, the tension we think we see was mostly smoke and mirrors, manufactured by the media, fueled by comparisons, and cemented by fan speculation. Alan Ladd and Robert Mitchum had almost nothing in common personally, but everything in common professionally. They played similar roles. The quiet loner, the antihero, the man with something dark bubbling beneath the surface. And because they occupied the same cinematic lane, they were constantly compared. In Hollywood, that's all it takes to spark rumors. But if you actually dig into their careers, you'll notice they didn't cross paths often. No major collaborations, no red carpet clashes, no public jabs. It's the silence between them that made fans fill in the blanks. What fueled the fire even more was their stark contrast in style. Ladd was clean-cut, soft-spoken, almost fragile in demeanor. Mitchum, on the other hand, was brash, sarcastic, and walked through Hollywood like he didn't care if it collapsed behind him. One was careful and composed, the other loose and unpredictable. When two icons carry that kind of energy in the same industry, it's no wonder people imagine sparks flying. But in reality, it was more like ships passing in the night. One of the few near collisions between their careers was when both were floated for similar roles. There was chatter around casting choices and behind-the-scenes decisions, but neither actor ever called the other out. Mitchum was known for joking about everything, including other stars, but never once made Ladd a target. Ladd, notoriously private and humble, didn't indulge in any public drama. And that's where the misunderstanding creeps in. Fans, journalists, and even studios created a myth because it was more entertaining than the truth. Behind all the gossip, Ladd was dealing with his own battles. He struggled with self-image and emotional pressure from the expectations placed on him. His short stature made him an unlikely leading man by Hollywood standards, and that insecurity stayed with him. Mitchum, meanwhile, battled a reputation for being difficult or dismissive, but he used that to build a persona that audiences couldn't look away from. These weren't enemies. They were survivors of a brutal system that pitted them against each other without ever asking them how they felt about it. So no, Alan Ladd didn't hate Robert Mitchum, but Hollywood needed a rivalry. And when two stars share a spotlight, people love to imagine a fight behind the curtain. In this case, the only thing real was a myth. If Alan Ladd and Robert Mitchum had been in the same film together, it would have been like watching ice meet fire. Not because they clashed personally, but because their screen styles were so wildly different, they almost felt like opposite poles of classic Hollywood masculinity. Alan Ladd was a portrait of restraint. He didn't need big monologues or wild outbursts to command attention. His power came from stillness, those quiet moments where his eyes told you everything. In movies like Shane, he barely spoke more than a few lines at a time, but you felt the weight of every single word. He was precise, polished, and completely in control. To audiences, Ladd wasn't just playing a role. He was the role, the man with something to prove, always one step away from breaking. Now, imagine placing that next to Robert Mitchum. Mitchum didn't do restraint. His performances oozed with relaxed danger. He looked like he could sleepwalk through a scene and still steal it. He didn't care if the camera caught every nuance. He just was. That effortless charisma, that sense of looming unpredictability, that's what made him magnetic. In films like Out of the Past, Mitchum didn't try to be cool. He just was cool, and that terrified directors and thrilled audiences. So when people compared them, it wasn't about who was better. It was about style, and those styles could not have been more different. Ladd was the tightly wound soldier. Mitchum was the loose cannon. That contrast created a fascinating tension, even though they never shared screen time. It's almost as if the audience staged their own imaginary showdown, one that played out in reviews, interviews, and fan debates. But here's where it gets really interesting. Their real-life personas didn't stray far from their on-screen images. Ladd was reserved, often uncomfortable with the fame that came his way. He wasn't the kind of guy who showed up drunk to a party or gave outrageous interviews. Mitchum, that was his whole brand. He once famously shrugged off a short jail stint with a quote that basically said, "They caught me, so what?" That kind of attitude was unheard of at the time, and it made him seem untouchable. To fans, that only deepened the divide. You were either in a Ladd camp, loyal, controlled, maybe a little brooding, or the Mitchum camp, rebellious, brash, and unapologetic. That invisible line carved a silent rivalry into Hollywood's memory, even if the two men never asked for it. But this wasn't a feud. It was a style clash, one that never needed words or public stunts to exist. It lived in how they moved, how they spoke, how they stared down a camera, and made you believe they were the only person in the room worth watching. And just when you think it ends there, another layer peels back, because behind their signature styles, both men were hiding things Hollywood didn't want you to see. And that's where things really started to twist. To the public, Alan Ladd looked like the perfect leading man. Suave, mysterious, composed. But underneath that smooth exterior was a man constantly battling his own insecurities. Ladd wasn't just short by Hollywood standards. He was genuinely self-conscious about his height. At just over 5 feet 6 inches, he often acted opposite much taller co-stars. The studio went to extremes to protect his image, using camera angles, boxes to stand on, even modifying sets so he'd appear taller. And yet, no amount of trickery could fix how he felt when he looked in the mirror. This internal battle wasn't just about vanity. Ladd struggled with deep-rooted feelings of inadequacy. Growing up during the Great Depression, he came from a background of poverty and instability. Acting wasn't just a dream, it was survival. He needed to prove himself in a town where image was everything. And that pressure, that constant need to measure up, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about being enough. Meanwhile, Robert Mitchum, cool, untouchable, devil-may-care, had his own battles, but he wore them differently. Mitchum had a wild youth, getting arrested for everything from vagrancy to marijuana possession. He'd been homeless, a laborer, a boxer, you name it. And while he made it seem like none of it mattered, the truth was more complicated. Mitchum used indifference as armor. He knew Hollywood could chew you up and spit you out, so he never let it get too close. He made everything look effortless. But behind the scenes, he was just as shaped by trauma and instability as Ladd. The difference? Mitchum chose to laugh it off, even when it nearly cost him everything. And that's where the deeper tension between them brewed. Not just in style, but in how they handled pressure. Ladd internalized everything. He bottled it up, tried to hold on to control, even as the cracks began to show. Mitchum, on the other hand, let it all spill out with a smirk. The fights, the booze, the run-ins with the law, it was all part of his mystique. But that didn't mean he wasn't struggling. Their opposing masks made it nearly impossible for them to understand one another. Ladd reportedly saw Mitchum as careless, even reckless, someone who didn't respect the craft or the rules. And Mitchum? He likely saw Ladd as uptight, overly polished, maybe even a little fake. Neither one was truly right or wrong, but those silent judgments built a wall between them. And as their careers progressed, that wall only grew. Ladd's self-doubt continued to haunt him, pushing him toward dark habits and moments of deep isolation. Mitchum's confidence, meanwhile, often crossed a line into arrogance, earning him both admiration and enemies. But the real story wasn't the feud the tabloids never published. It was in the pain neither actor ever really addressed. Because both men, giants in their own way, were quietly unraveling under the surface. And what happened when Hollywood started to turn its back on them would reveal even more about who they really were. By the late 1950s, the world around Alan Ladd and Robert Mitchum was shifting, and fast. The golden era of Hollywood, with its glossy studio-controlled stars and tightly managed images, was starting to fade. Audiences wanted something grittier, more real. Television was stealing attention from the silver screen, and the idea of what a leading man should look like was changing. For someone like Robert Mitchum, this was a blessing. For Alan Ladd, it was a slow-motion nightmare. Mitchum had always been a bit of an outsider in the Hollywood system. His rebellious attitude, rough demeanor, and "I don't care" swagger were exactly what the new generation craved. He fit right into the wave of anti-heroes that began to dominate the screen. Directors loved his edge, his unpredictability. He could play dangerous and charming in the same breath. Suddenly, the things that had once gotten him in trouble were the very qualities that made him irresistible to modern audiences. Ladd, on the other hand, was the poster child for the old-school movie star. Handsome, brooding, polished, but in a way that now felt manufactured. The type of leading man who looked perfect under soft lighting, but didn't quite connect with a crowd looking for grit and flaws. His quiet intensity, which had once made him a box office draw, now made him look like a relic from a fading era. And he could feel it. Every role that went to someone else, every lukewarm review, it chipped away at him. What made it worse? Mitchum was thriving. The very man Ladd had never quite liked, had never quite trusted, was climbing higher just as he was losing ground. It wasn't just professional jealousy. It was a personal wound. Ladd had spent years holding himself together, playing by the rules, working relentlessly to project an image of strength and mystery. Mitchum seemed to be coasting, winning simply by being himself. And that contrast stung. But here's the catch. Mitchum wasn't coasting. He was just better at hiding the toll. Behind the scenes, he was exhausted. The constant attention, the drinking, the public expectations. It all wore on him. But he didn't let it show. Not the way Ladd did. Ladd began turning down roles, not out of pride, but because he didn't feel he could live up to them. He was terrified of failing, of being exposed as washed up. His health was faltering, his confidence slipping. In the industry, he gave everything to was starting to move on without him. Meanwhile, Mitchum was being celebrated for the very attitude that made him so difficult to work with. He'd become a symbol of the rugged, modern man, flawed, unpredictable, but undeniably magnetic. Ladd was left watching from the sidelines, a reminder of a version of Hollywood that no longer fit the times. But the final chapters of their stories weren't just shaped by fame or fortune. They were shaped by the one thing neither man could escape. And when that moment came, it would change everything. By the early 1960s, Alan Ladd wasn't just fading from the spotlight. He was unraveling behind the scenes. The pressure to maintain his image, the fear of being forgotten, and the haunting sense that his best days were behind him, it all took a devastating toll. While fans remembered him as the quiet, brooding hero Shane, and this gun for hire, the man behind the camera was fighting demons far louder than any role he ever played. Ladd's insecurities were no secret to those close to him. He was a perfectionist to a fault, never satisfied with performance, always worried the audience would see through him. He felt small, literally and figuratively, in an industry that now idolized the bold, the brash, and the untamed. And no one embodied that better than Robert Mitchum. The contrast was unbearable. Mitchum was still landing major roles, still defying Hollywood norms with his signature smirk and bad boy charm. Ladd, meanwhile, was battling insomnia, turned to sleeping pills and alcohol just to get through the night. His self-worth had become tied to a version of Hollywood that no longer existed, and watching Mitchum thrive in the new era only deepened the wound. Behind closed doors, Ladd's resentment toward Mitchum boiled. It wasn't about a single event or a public feud. It was a slow burn of watching someone you never respected rise while you sank. Ladd didn't just dislike Mitchum. He envied the freedom Mitchum had to be himself, to act recklessly, and still be rewarded. Ladd had spent his life trying to be perfect. Mitchum had done the opposite, and somehow won. The few times their paths crossed in those later years, the tension was almost unbearable. Mitchum, aloof as ever, treated Ladd with casual indifference, which only made things worse. Ladd saw it as disrespect. Mitchum saw it as business as usual. but there was no hiding the bitterness. Hollywood insiders would whisper about the cold stares, the clipped words exchanged at parties, the undeniable discomfort when both men were in the same room. And then came the health scares. Ladd's physical and mental health were both deteriorating. The sleepless nights, the pressure, and the dependence on medication had caught up to him. He suffered an accident, an incident that many quietly speculated wasn't entirely accidental. The public explanation was vague, but those close to him knew he was spiraling. He wasn't just exhausted, he was lost. Mitchum, for all his flaws, carried on, stoic, detached, and seemingly untouchable. But the tragedy of Alan Ladd's decline left even the most hardened Hollywood figures shaken. The man who once captivated millions was slipping away, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But there was still one chapter left to be written, a chapter that would shock the industry and bring the story full circle in a way no one expected. Alan Ladd's final years were a slow-motion heartbreak. Quiet, him behind closed doors, but deeply felt by anyone who had ever admired him. In January 1964, at just 50 years old, Alan Ladd was found dead in his Palm Springs home. Officially, it was ruled an accidental combination of alcohol and sedatives, but many insiders weren't convinced. The whispers began almost immediately. Friends spoke of his deepening depression. Others mentioned his growing disillusionment with Hollywood. Whatever the cause, one thing was clear. Ladd died not as a star, but as a man Hollywood had forgotten. The news hit the entertainment world like a thunderclap. Fans mourned the loss of the man who defined an era of golden age masculinity. But for those inside the industry, especially those who knew the behind-the-scenes tension between Ladd and Mitchum, it felt like the end of something much deeper, a generational shift, a passing of the torch, and a painful reminder that fame often comes with a hidden cost. As for Robert Mitchum, his reaction, or lack thereof, was telling. He made no public statement, offered no tribute. Some interpreted that silence as cold indifference. Others saw it as a sign of quiet guilt, or perhaps a realization that the rivalry had never really been mutual. Mitchum had always brushed off rumors of any feud, but insiders knew the truth. Whether he admitted it or not, he had played a role, however indirect, in the downward spiral of a man who had once been his peer. But in a strange twist, Ladd's death did something unexpected. It humanized him in a way Hollywood had never allowed during his lifetime. Suddenly, critics and historians began to look back at his career with fresh eyes. They recognized the vulnerability he brought to his roles, the quiet intensity that set him apart. He wasn't just a good-looking leading man. He was an actor struggling to be seen for more than just his face. That struggle, it turned out, was the most relatable thing about him. In the years that followed, Alan Ladd's legacy slowly began to rebuild. His son, Alan Ladd Jr., would go on to become one of the most powerful producers in Hollywood, greenlighting classics like Star Wars and Braveheart. Through his son, Ladd's name found new life, attached to some of the biggest films of all time. It was as if the Hollywood lad had fought so hard to impress finally gave him the recognition he'd always deserved, just not in the way he expected. Meanwhile, Robert Mitchum continued to work well into the 80s and 90s. His legend cemented, his reputation as a cool rebel intact. But the story of Alan Ladd lingered. It served as a haunting reminder that even the brightest stars can burn out in silence, and that behind every silver screen legend, there's a human story the public never fully sees. And sometimes, the rivalries we think we understand are far more personal, painful, and tragic than we ever imagined. Alan Ladd and Robert Mitchum, two names etched into Hollywood's golden era, yet forever linked by more than just shared screen time. Their alleged rivalry wasn't merely about fame, box office numbers, or leading man status. It was about identity, image, and the brutal reality of a system that could lift you up just as quickly as it forgot you. When we look back at the tension between these two icons, it's tempting to frame it as a classic Hollywood feud. One star jealous of the other's rising power. But the truth runs deeper. Ladd wasn't threatened by Mitchum's talent. He was threatened by what Mitchum represented, a changing tide in film. Where Ladd symbolized the tightly controlled, polished masculinity of old Hollywood, Mitchum embodied something raw, unfiltered, and increasingly in demand. That contrast was less about personal hatred and more about fear. Fear of being replaced, of becoming irrelevant, of watching your carefully built persona crumble in a world that no longer wanted it. Mitchum, for his part, never seemed interested in playing the rivalry game. Whether that was genuine indifference or calculated cool is still up for debate, but his silence, especially after Ladd's death, spoke volumes. Sometimes what's not said says more than 1,000 interviews ever could. And maybe Mitchum understood what few others did. That Ladd's struggles weren't just about career. They were about identity, self-worth, and the high price of trying to be perfect in an industry that thrives on flaws. Ladd's tragic ending, contrasted with Mitchum's long, unbothered reign, makes their story feel almost Shakespearean. It reminds us that Hollywood isn't just a place where movies are made. It's a pressure cooker of egos, insecurities, and impossible expectations. And while some thrive under that pressure, others quietly unravel. What makes this story linger decades later isn't just a drama. It's the humanity behind it. Ladd wasn't just a victim of studio politics or fading fame. He was a man who wanted to be seen for more than his appearance, who fought against the very image that had made him a star. In many ways, he never stood a chance. Not because of Mitchum, but because of the system that pitted them against each other in the first place. In the end, the feud between Alan Ladd and Robert Mitchum may never be fully understood. Was it real? Was it exaggerated by gossip columns and studio publicity? Or was it something deeper? Two very different men standing on opposite ends of a generational shift, forced to compete in a game neither one created? What we do know is this: their story still resonates, not because it's scandalous, but because it's real. Behind every feud, there's a fracture. Behind every legend, a vulnerability. And behind every headline, a human being simply trying to survive in a town that feeds on reinvention. That's the real legacy of Alan Ladd and Robert Mitchum. Not just two stars in conflict, but two lives shaped, strained, and ultimately defined by the unforgiving spotlight of Hollywood.